Kia ora and welcome to this month's Tech Bytes. I'm Craig Young, the CEO of 25Jun06, and this is episode 48. I didn't realize I'd done so many of these Tech Byte conversations. We're switching these up a little bit this year and talking to our digital leaders a little bit about their background as we have over the last couple of years, but also looking at some of the key issues and topics that we've been thinking about when it comes to 25Jun06. And so at the moment, we're in the quarter where we're thinking about access and inclusion. We had the summit 2 weeks ago, which was incredibly, well, I thought it was successful, but then when you're the host, you hope things go well. Today, I'm really fortunate and to be talking to Benoit Felten. Benoit is in France, and obviously it's evening for him, so it's morning for me. So good evening, Benoit.
Good morning to you.
Yeah. How about you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and a little bit more about where you're based?
Yeah, so I am, I suppose I could call myself an industry expert by this point. I started working in fiber-related stuff in 1997, so it's been a while. And I've been consulting for about 25 years, so I've seen a wide range of situations and happenings in the industry. I often joke that I was the original fiber guy on Twitter before I departed what had become not the platform I had joined initially. And incidentally, I am now fiber guy again on Blue Sky, but that's very confidential at this stage. And yeah, I've been working around access quite a lot over my career, not exclusively, but obviously it's been a big part of my work. And for 8 years, I was living in Asia and Shanghai and then Hong Kong. And a little bit before that, and during that period, I was over in New Zealand quite frequently, working with various parties around the National Broadband Plan and all that happened there. So hopefully I understand the NZ market a little bit better than most other foreign analysts do.
Yeah, I think we've met several times that you've been in New Zealand, maybe right back in my chorus days, actually. And obviously since I've been in this role as well. And I was tempted to call you the father of fiber, but that would be more probably left. We need to leave that to the people that actually developed it and designed it.
Exactly. That's for an engineer to take on. Yeah.
Yeah, you're more of a person who is looking at it and making it work, or trying to understand how it works. So look, how did you actually get started in being this fiber guru? What got you into this space?
So back in, I think it was late 2005, I had a weird but actually surprisingly common short disease called a cytomegalovirus, which effectively knocks you off for about 6 weeks, and there's nothing you can do apart from sleep. So I was off work for about 6 weeks, sleeping about 14, 15 hours a day. And the rest of my time, I started looking into the fiber plans of various European companies that were starting to make some noise around it at a time where the consensus was, whoa, this is way too expensive, never going to happen. And I felt it was sufficiently interesting to start a blog about it, which was Fiber Evolution. And I started writing about this stuff kind of as a hobby. But as I moved forward in my career, the fact that I had looked into this and understood it a little bit better than others actually gave me work opportunities, and it became kind of my bread and butter for quite a few years, and it still is to a certain extent, because ironically, some of the issues that interestingly enough, some of the issues that I discussed in New Zealand in 2009 when Comcom invited me to their summit on fiber are still live today and haven't been really solved or addressed. So yeah, no, there's a lot of continuity in there, but of course there's a lot of differences as well and changes, and the biggest one being that it went from being it's too expensive, no one's going to do it, to why haven't you done it yet? So
yeah. Well, look, you mentioned there you came over in 2009, so you've been to New Zealand quite a few times. You mentioned that you probably have a very good perspective on our market. You've seen, you know, from the outside, which is unique and useful. So what are some of your impressions on, well, in 2009, how prepared for the future we were, and then to where we are now?
So I have and still do use New Zealand as one of my most positive use cases in terms of public policy when it comes to accelerating or generating the deployment of next generation infrastructure, as we used to call it. And I mean, the model, I'm still, you know, amazed at how clever the model was. Because unlike in other countries, there was no enforced deployment. There was just, the incentives were so strong that the various participants in the ecosystem had only one way to go. But it's quite clever in that sense. And I remember, I mean, there was a lot of question marks in 2009. I remember going back in, I think it was 2011 and 2012, and having meetings with various ministry and regulatory people, and they were all super worried because take-up was, you know, 7 or 8%, and there was a lot of talk about, are we not digital enough, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, come on, your infrastructure's been in the market for a year and a half. You know, there's no reason to worry now. And then the next time I was there, which must have been 2013 or 2014, take-up was at 35 or 40, and then suddenly that problem was entirely gone away. So, you know, there's been a few glitches. The whole copper pricing review debacle was, you know, something that could have been avoided probably, but it got sorted in the end, and it probably also prompted a review of kind of regulatory thinking in a way that I think was necessary. So maybe it was, you know, a painful way to get to somewhere that needed to be gotten to anyway. The last time I was over, which was 2022, the big question was, okay, we've effectively, the initial plan's been executed on, but there's still about, you know, 25% of the country that doesn't have fiber, or 25% of the premises that don't have fiber. And, you know, that's maybe where I would be a bit more critical, because I think the two could have been done in parallel, and it seems like the focus was on covering the 75% or 71 or whatever the exact number was, but I know it's been extended now a little bit. You know, and rural policies in parallel were very short term, and at least when I looked at it in depth in 2022, ineffectual. I don't know if that's significantly changed now. I think, you know, there's a lot of reasons why thinking of fiber as a universal resource, even if the cost to connect the last few percentage points is very high, but at the same time we did it for copper. So, you know, there's a way in which you say, well, how are we worse than we were 100 years ago? Surely not. I mean, it's a difference of viewpoint more than anything, I think. So, I mean, to me, to a large extent, New Zealand fixed access is a very successful model, and I wish more public policy people were looking at it in a way other than saying, oh, they're on the other side of the world and it's a small country, so there's nothing to learn from that. I think there's a whole lot that could be learned from it. But of course, the more you let the market pluck the ripe fruit, the cheap areas, etc., the least public policy can do that's effective. So I think doing it before anything significant had happened was a key factor in that success. And when you look at the French model, you see the same thing. The fact that the regulation came in before deployment happened made a huge difference. And now you see countries like Germany and Italy who are trying to impose regulation after most of the profitable areas have already been deployed. That's really complicated.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit more about Europe. You know, and when it comes to network availability, you already talked about a couple of examples. What about the, you know, how do we compare to the reach and quality of some of those better examples, and what might we be missing?
So there's two things, because if we're talking about coverage and availability, we have to take mobile into account as well. So in terms of fixed access, if you consider fiber to be the baseline, or at least an equivalent service to fiber, which would be the latest generations of cable potentially, then you see that even amongst the large European countries, there's a huge disparity in coverage. So countries like Italy, Germany, the UK, not in the EU, but in Europe, way behind in terms of coverage, also way behind in terms of fiber adoption. Whereas countries like France, Spain, the Netherlands, the Nordics, very high coverage and very high penetration. A lot of it is down to whether VDSL was pushed strongly as an evolution of ADSL. So if you look at Spain and France, the network configurations made VDSL not a very effective solution to reach a large part of the population. So very early on, either the incumbent themselves or the regulator said not an option. In other countries, VDSL became the norm, and then you have a 70 to 100 meg service, and fiber is coming along and saying, well, you can get 500, and you go, well, I'm not sure I really need that. So take up is a much more complicated story there. When it comes to mobile, general coverage is, I think, pretty good in most European countries. 5G is a bit more uneven, and then standalone is even more uneven. But again, we're talking about, this is not a popular view necessarily, but I still struggle to understand the business case of 5G over 4G LTE plus, and I struggle to understand the business case of standalone to regular 5G. So I think we're looking at successive generations of technologies that the operators themselves are struggling to really generate cash, pay for themselves. And I think that explains the comparatively slow pace of deployment. And of course, if we look at the world leaders in this area, we're going to look at China and Korea and Japan, countries where these types of decisions are usually not solely based on profitability and business models. There's a lot of governmental involvement in basically setting the targets and making the market players achieve those targets. Whether it's really profitable or not is not really part of the equation. I mean, I often use this example when people look at the, frankly, astounding Chinese fiber coverage numbers. And I say, do you think there was actually a board meeting where someone reviewed the business plan and said, yep, let's do that? Never happened. The party said, you need to do this, and they did it. In some ways, dictatorships have their benefits, I suppose.
They do.
But so I think comparing ourselves to them is, in that sense, not very relevant. By and large, I suppose what I would say is I don't see any gap that should warrant being worried about it. So, the European Commission has been touting this story for a couple of years now, that we're lagging behind and etc. But no one is capable of articulating something that we cannot do with our infrastructure that the US or China or anyone else can do. And I think at the end of the day, that's the biggest question. The only incentive that I saw at the time for being early on 5G is if you were actually, a country that had a technology vendor positioned in 5G yourself, then it makes sense, because, if you're the first, then you can use that as a launch pad to. So why did Korea push as much as they did? Because they've got LG and Samsung, and these guys are selling 5G equipment. Similarly, if you're going to take the view that 5G will empower driverless cars, for example, then if you have car manufacturers, you could say, well, we need to have that in order to have this. I think we're still quite far away from driverless cars, but that's neither here nor there. But you see what I mean? From an industrial point of view, I don't think Europe is lagging behind, first of all, and I also don't think that they're missing anything because of that. I think vendors and the tech ecosystem as a whole has become very adept at painting a dark picture in order to, incentivize investment. And fair enough, it's marketing, but we should sometimes recognize that it is marketing.
Yeah. Well, we're just talking about those future technologies, because I know you're the fiber guy. You're the guru. You're the one that loves pieces of glass on the ground or on poles. But what other technologies are you keeping an eye on that might be developing out over the next few years?
You mean in the kind of broadband space, or?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think everything that we're looking at from now on is kind of marginal efficiency gains, or so for example, the Chinese vendors have been trying to very strongly position what they call fiber to the room, which is really an indoor passive optical network. So it's a kind of sub network within your home that acts as an enterprise LAN, but over fiber. I still think the cost is too high for this to be broadly adopted, and I don't think it's going to become industry norm. It's going to be something that rich people are going to get for their homes because it just makes everything more convenient. But is it really necessary? I don't think so. It's nice to have.
I remember, just on that one, I remember going to a presentation, 10, 15 years ago, somebody trying to sell that type of in-house fiber, but it was plastic, and it was quite thick plastic.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be...
now it's very thin.
Right. Yeah.
That's their selling point, is it's nigh on invisible. It really is super, super thin, but it's still a home install, and still it might work in countries where labor is very, very cheap. I don't think it's going to fly in Europe or the US in any significant way. I mean, obviously, evolutions in Wi-Fi are an important component of all of this, because we tend to forget that there's way more data traveling on Wi-Fi than there is on mobile networks. Way more. I mean, it's like 20 to 80%. And so, yeah, evolutions on Wi-Fi, and particularly right now with WRC 27 just looming closer and closer. This whole struggle with the spectrum that Wi-Fi uses, that the mobile operators are trying to grab for themselves, and that's been a tussle for a number of years now. I don't know if it'll be resolved in 27, but it's something I'm looking at, because obviously that would have significant impact on the efficiency of Wi-Fi itself. Having lived in Hong Kong, in a building where I could see about 50 Wi-Fi networks from my living room, it makes you think about saturation in an entirely different way. So I think there's a lot of smaller things that are happening. Obviously, we are in the middle of a shift on the fiber side from standard GPON to 10 GPON, or XGS-PON as the technology is called primarily. We're probably about halfway through transitioning, which means that people who are deploying greenfield fiber now will go for XGS-PON immediately. So I think we can safely anticipate that within a few years, the norm in terms of technology capability, the norm will be 10 GPON rather than the standard, which is about 2.5. Vendors are pushing for 25 and 50. I really struggle to see this taking off in the foreseeable future. I think we're reaching a point, and we're seeing this in overall statistics, where we see that data usage, for example, the growth is really, really slowing down to a point where we can probably anticipate that within a couple of years it'll be flat. So I think the case for successive generations of faster and faster access technologies, whether it's on fixed or mobile, I think that's going to go away, or at least become less relevant. The question is more, I think, about, first of all, filling in the gaps. So as we started with, there's still significant portions of population, even in the developed world, that don't have access to fiber and don't have any decent technology alternative. Then maybe we can see into satellite for a second, because that's kind of the new kid on the block. My largely uninformed view, let's put it that way, because I haven't done the math, is that I think there is a strong limit to the satellite business model in terms of how many customers it can sustain in a given market. So I think the threat of satellite taking away, 10 or 15% of the market is overinflated, although having access to the numbers and doing the math would probably confirm that, but it needs to be done at least by someone, if not by me. Similarly, and we've seen this in New Zealand, there is a chunk of the market that can go to fixed wireless access. But again, I think that plateaus at a few percentage points, maybe shy of 10%. It's not insignificant, but it's also not, a threat to the kind of core model being the fiber platform itself. So I don't see any huge disruptions in that area, let's put it that way. I think efficiencies for sure. AI may also introduce various ways of doing things a little bit better, although again, because we're in the full hype cycle of AI, there's a lot of stuff that's mentioned, which is, I think, absolutely irrelevant. I was quite pleased at the last FTTH Council event in Amsterdam to hear someone say, if you're going to use AI to do repetitive tasks that you have to do every day, it's going to cost more than the people you're currently hiring to do it. So, think hard about what you want to do with AI, which I think is a very, very good recommendation.
Yeah. I'm a huge believer in the Gartner hype curve and how that works. Look, just you commented about fixed wireless. What we're seeing happening here as well is all those smaller regional players who had rolled out fixed wireless on using government grant money are now looking at doing their own little fiber networks and rolling out fiber and calling themselves fists, I think they're calling themselves. But so we are seeing other ways of doing it. And talking about that, give me on a slightly different tack. We've talked about the access side. Now let's talk about inclusion for a minute. But how do we connect, from your perspective and seeing around the world, how do we connect those that aren't connected because of, I don't know, affordability, knowledge, they're not aware? But have you got any ideas or thoughts on that one?
So I think I don't want to underplay affordability. I think it's a key issue. However, if you look around, there's actually, every government in Europe, for example, has various forms of inclusion on the grounds of insufficient revenue and stuff like that, whether it's generic help from Social Security or specific plans for adoption. One thing that I've found out in the last few years is that I think awareness and I don't know how to frame it exactly. Maybe the sense that you actually need it. I think this is the biggest hurdle. So I think there's an element of thinking that the current generation is 100% going to be connected. I no longer believe in that. I think some people simply don't feel the need to be connected, and as long as they're alive, that'll probably stay that way. Now, subsequent generations, that will no longer be true, if only because all public services will be online, and if you're not connected, you're going to be disconnected from some pretty vital services. But I think we're not quite there yet. So I was looking at this for Italy, for example. Italy is one of the countries in Europe that has the highest percentage of ADSL subscribers still, and it's flat. It's not going down. And actually, the weird thing is when you look at pricing, you see that it's more expensive to buy ADSL, or what they pay every month for ADSL, because it's a 10-year-old pricing scheme, is actually more than what they would pay for VDSL or fiber. But they're not changing because they feel it's enough and they don't like to change. And so I think we're maybe moving into something that would look a little bit more like DTT switch off and these kind of things, where you have to think about how you accompany people to make shifts that they fear, even though there's no reason to be afraid. It's just that it's disruption in their lives. One of the schemes that I always felt was quite clever, and I'm not here to throw roses at the French in any particular way, but one of the things that they did for the DTT switchover is that the government actually contracted out with the post office, and they trained postmen and women to help elderly people or people who were concerned just install the new box and move the cable over and set the TV up. And it worked wonderfully, because basically, especially if you're of an older generation, everyone knows their postman, because you come out when the postman comes every day, and he comes out at the same time every day, etc. And so there's an element of trust there that makes it easier for these people to say, all right, sure, come into my house and set this up for me. And it's free, because we were trying to shift them over, so there was benefit at the end of it. And I think we maybe need to be thinking about this kind of, in a sense, it's taking someone by the hand and carrying them over that very small threshold, but one that is significant down the line. The other thing is, I was talking about it a minute ago, and actually last time I was in New Zealand, that was a big part of the conversation around rural, is that, governments are moving all their public services online, whether we like it or not. So there's an element of being disconnected from way more vital things than, entertainment and even communications to some extent. And there's another element and this is where I think a lot of governments are not being ambitious enough, is if you think about it, when you design these services, these e-government services, you have to take into account how much bandwidth people are going to have to access them. And that means that they're all designed on the basis of the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
So you're not thinking, well, okay, if I assume everyone has 500 meg or 200 meg bandwidth, how could I design the service differently so that it would be easier to use, so that there'd be video components that people can, interact with, so that maybe, again, I'm very critical of all of these silly entertainment uses of AI that cost huge resources and put designers out of business, right? But having a proper digital assistant when you're doing your tax or filling in your social security stuff online, that would require more significant amounts of bandwidth. But you can't do that if everyone in rural areas is on 4 meg ADSL or 10 meg mobile. Yeah. So there's an element also of, I guess, not having fully integrated this. One of the things that I liked about New Zealand is that once the plan was put in motion, the metrics that the government was looking at was take up. It was not just deployment, right? But you look in Europe and you see hundreds of millions of euros that have been poured into deploying fiber networks in deep rural areas where they would never have existed otherwise. And no one's looking at the take up. Right. And that to me is madness, because an efficient use of public money would be, the goal is to get people on it. It's not to get the infrastructure deployed. So I think maybe there's a bit of an overemphasis on coverage as a metric as well versus adoption.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful commentary, and interesting to hear some of the innovative ways of doing it. We've got, obviously, we're in the middle of the 3G switch off, So all the 3 networks are switching off this year. So, we're dealing with that issue. But then Chorus has also said they want to be off copper by 2030. So, we're going to have to help people along that journey. So good conversations. Look, let's just move on a little bit, getting towards the end of our time. But, considering your experience across the globe, what role do you see organisations like ours, like 2Ns in New Zealand, playing in shaping the future of this adoption and policy in a country like ours?
Well, I think, one of the things that I've always been very conscious of is that, like it or not, telcos in general, and I'm putting the pure wholesalers and the vertically integrated guys in the same basket here. They're very good at deploying and managing their networks and selling the services that these networks allow. They are very bad, no matter how they try, at shaping new usage. And one of the things that I think kind of neutral organizations need to focus on a lot more is, what can people do with this that is not profitable enough that all of the big tech companies are going to offer it, but are socially useful? And I think this is one of the things that we have lost a little bit since the early days of the internet, where there was a utopian feel about how connection could change the world. And it has changed the world, but not necessarily in the ways that we would have liked, or that are the most socially beneficial. And I think there needs to be a discourse that is focused on usage that delivers social good, as opposed to just usage that delivers money. And I think this is where I've always liked the voice that 2Ns put forward, because it is a shift in perspective from you're part of the ecosystem, but you are also a part, in a sense, because you're not looking at this as a profit-making machine. You're looking at the much broader issues. And I think that type of voice is important. And I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of articulating what the social good is going to be that comes out of it, and what needs to change for it to emerge. And I think a big part of the moment that we're in now is when we are starting to realize that we have effectively given the keys to the van to a small number of massive global companies that are effectively pulling nearly all the strings. And how we roll that back is, to me, one of the key questions. On a personal level, I'm going through a process of deplatforming my stuff as much as I can. There are still services that I think I'm getting more use out of than what it costs me in terms of loss of independence or data being sucked. And so I'm still willing to use them. But anything that doesn't fit that, I'm trying to eliminate effectively. And it takes time and it takes a bit of money, but not as much as I feared it would. Right. And there's an element of reassurance in that the thing that we have now experienced, all of us, way too often, which is they decide to change something to the service, it becomes shit, and you're stuck and there's nothing you can do about it. At least you get a bit more freedom to say, well, proactively, that's not going to happen.
You sound like you're going to be the new Maria Kondo of technology, Benoit.
No,
if it doesn't bring you joy, don't pay for it.
Well, you're right, though. I mean, yeah. or actually, we're not paying for it. Well, we are, but not in tangible money. But yeah, don't engage for sure. I think that's and just to be clear, and I don't want to be preachy on anyone. I'm still way more hooked to a lot of these services than is healthy, but I'm trying to dial it back. Basically, it's like I'm an alcoholic, but I'm trying to address it.
Hey, look, it's been a real pleasure and a privilege to have this chat with you, Benoit, and thank you for giving up some of your evening as well. One of the things I want to do this year is start bringing this question in, which I did send through to you beforehand, so you got to think about it. But let's finish up with a final question on a couple of books that you're reading or you've read that you'd recommend to people listening to this.
Right. So there's one that I'm reading and one that I haven't read yet because it just came out and I don't have a copy. So the first one is a book by Cory Doctorow and Rebecca Giblin called Choke Point Capitalism. And it's really interesting in that it articulates how the platforms have effectively kind of captured this middle ground in these two-sided models in a way that is nearly unescapable now. But what's really interesting about it is that it articulates regulatory measures that could be put in place that would alleviate that, or at least give users and governments back some control over what's happening there. So that's definitely a book I would recommend. And more generally, anything Cory Doctorow writes is both entertaining and insightful, including his fiction, I should add. And then the second book is by a guy I admire a lot, a guy called Richard Witt. And he has just released, like this week or the week before, a book called Reweaving the Web, which, as I understand it, takes a more kind of holistic look at how we can collectively try to go back to the roots of what the web was supposed to deliver. And I'm very anxious to read this because I think it's really something we need to think about. And I'm thinking about on a daily basis.
Yeah. Hey, well, as I said, Benoit, it's been great to talk to you. Looking forward to hopefully seeing you in New Zealand again at some time soon anyway, and being able to chat to you again. So thank you very much for your time.
Feel free to tell anyone in the New Zealand ecosystem that if they're willing to pay for me to come, I'm willing to come.
Thanks very much.
All right. Goodbye.